Ladies and gentlemen, we have spent weeks judging this man, Bob Greaves, and everything that he's had to talk to us about. But today, I didn't want to tell you this, but Bob made me. He wants to have a word with you. And I don't know what that's about. I think he wants to have a word with me too. We're going to find out in just a moment on the Unconventional Pastor.
Well, good evening, and it's good to be back again to talk to you tonight. Tonight, I'm going to do actually something a little bit different. As I told Joe, I said, "Yeah, I'm going to have a word with you," and that is, I'm going to even talk about this word called "word," and talk about some of the implications about it and how it's affected us throughout the history of Christian theology, and uh, and it's one of the most prominent sections of the biblical text that we have found that deals with this is found in the gospel attributed to John, that very first chapter. And I when I read this, I find that there's such a depth of meaning in such few words that are actually in the original small words, but very rich in a way that is difficult to translate, and in a way which I really think that in the difficulty of translating it has actually lent to the misuse of John chapter 1 to be saying things or implying things or establishing things that it doesn't really establish. Now, first of all, the problem of translation is not unique to the Bible. Many people don't understand how language works, and in fact, when you begin to tell them how language works, most people will have the reaction of, "No, no, 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 that's not right." You know, in fact, linguistic anthropology is probably one of those fields where, until you actually begin to study it, you don't realize how it really operates at a level other than the superficial level of understanding language. Uh, we um, we use language to express ourselves, to veil ourselves, to do all sorts of things, and we use it as a behavior. And linguistics is an interesting field of study, in that we look at the way people use language, and we realize that people use it at a depth far deeper than they realize they use it. However, even though they don't realize how deeply they use it, they understand quite clearly what they're trying to say to an amazing degree, and they understand quite clearly the depth that is being communicated. But when it comes to realizing this, it's like we have this impression that it just works on the superficial level. And as a result, I think also that because we tend to use language in such a powerfully veiled manner, we like to deny that it lacks anything but just a straightforward use. So this problem is not unique to Greek, not unique to biblical Greek, not unique to dead languages. But in every language, we have things called words. Um, Not all languages identify words the same way that we would, and in fact, the notion of sentence and word is has not always been talked about, although it's been intuitively understood by people who use language. It hasn't always been something that we always talked about, which means that every language hasn't actually had a word for word. and that in our language, in English, where we talk about a word as being a singular sounding set of syllables and sounds that make reference to a specific idea or thing or whatever. Even for English, it's rather recent to talk of words in that way. Uh, I mean, originally people just used language because it communicated, and they didn't necessarily stop to think about how it works. It just seems to work. And in fact, throughout the globe, very few people ever ask themselves, "Well, how does this work?" In fact, the interesting thing is that a child acquires language without ever asking themselves, what is language and how does it work? And how do we do that? In fact, even Noam Chomsky, I think I talked about this before, discovered how children acquire the grammar and the syntax of any language that they grow up in very quickly without ever having to go through the process of eliminating all of the arbitrary possibilities that could be invoked or brought into meaning through the apparently arbitrary use of words and the fact that languages are in some ways very highly arbitrary, in other ways not. But I mean, for example, I guess I don't speak French, but what is it? La plume is the word that we use in French for apple. There's nothing about the sound of plume or of apple that actually refers to this fruit. Um, that's just the sounds that were used in respective languages when talking about that fruit, and it quickly caught on for whatever reasons, and people who use that language natively just without thinking about it acquire a recognition that when they hear that sound, this is what you're talking about, that particular kind of fruit. But something that also we don't stop to think about in languages is that in any language, words, particularly words that are far more sophisticated, these words possess what we call a domain of reference. And by that, and I don't want to bore you too much. I'm not going to talk too much about the technical stuff. By that, what we mean is that we come up with this sound, and this sound invokes when spoken, and is in fact spoken by somebody attempting to invoke this, an idea or a concept or points to something that is in it that we are attempting to communicate. And these words that we use will point to not anything totally specific or precise, but a domain that the word has a lot of flexibility to it, can be used in a variety of different contexts that will then hone down and narrow in on what we're trying to say. And the more sophisticated the concept, the more interesting that domain can be. I mean, when it comes to something like stick, when you're dealing with a stick of wood, um, there the concept isn't so complex in a sense. But if I'm using a word such as, say, justice, although there is a sense of what justice is, if one culture has a slightly, significantly different, but only slightly expressed concept of just what justice is, then when they use the word justice, chances are they are pointing at a concept that has more of the nuances of their philosophy of that culture as to what constitutes justice. And when we use the word justice, we use that word thinking of it in terms of what it points to in our philosophy of just what a language is. And that would mean that if there's a difference in philosophy between two different cultures, when I translate something said in that culture into something we can understand and read in our culture, and they use this word justice, I could, through that translation, imply that they're saying certain things that justice means to us, that it doesn't mean to them. And so what I'm trying to get at next here is to tell you that although these more sophisticated words point to a domain of reference, The domain of reference that various words point to is not the exact same domain in all languages. They're unique to a language. There are certain attitudes about words that certain people who've used them, a certain history with those words, so that there's actually baggage attached to words within a language. And that baggage would be different from culture to culture, which is one reason why in some cultures, well, in all cultures really, you might have some words that are the preferred word to be used by people at the lower rungs of society, and another word which means pretty much the same thing that is used by people at the upper rungs of that society. And even when there's not really that much difference meaning in the domain of reference that is given to those two different words, but the more wealthy and snooty upper class people wouldn't use the lower class word, and the lower class people, out of their own sense of dignity and pride, might not want to use the upper class word. And so, in this case, we actually end up with a word when used not only points to its domain of reference, but also has what we call indexicality. It points to such things as the social standing of the person who used the word, or at least the social standing they're making reference to. So that way, a wealthy person can use the lower class word in a sentence, and people will understand they are making reference to something lower class. And this can be a way of being snotty. It can be a way of being critical without necessarily taking responsibility for it, that veiled language I was telling you about. Anyhow, the point that I'm trying to make is this. Translation isn't always easy, and words have a life of their own. They really do, in a very real sense. And they operate within a culture that deals with them pretty much the same way we deal with, say, Lady Gaga and Madonna. It's a fad. Words come to be used in certain ways. They gather indexicality through history and through usage. The way they actually end up pointing to such things as social class, level of education, or other aspects they might point to that aren't necessarily immediately present in the immediate domain of reference. This is done through pure usage and nothing else. If it becomes popular for a certain segment of the society to use the word, they will. And when they do it, they don't realize that once it becomes established as a part of their section of society, it becomes an indexical word that points to that subdomain of the culture. So that's basically a small explanation of the concept of indexicality. So as it turns out, words and language operate at a level that is amazingly complex. All people handle it in that complex way, and yet we interface with it in a very superficial way. And there's a sense in which we put it through a funnel where we can keep it simple. This is part of what makes language so easy to acquire and so easy to use compared to what it would be if we actually had to have a completely different set of sounds to use for every completely different nuance of meaning. And we can't do that. That would just be a vocabulary of hundreds of thousands of words. And if you're my age, you're lucky if you have a vocabulary of 60, 70,000 words. Anyhow, I said all that to show off. No, I said all that because um, I want to take a look at the Gospel of John's first chapter, and I find in it some very rich ideas that I feel really get lost in translation. And it's a shame that they do because there's something here being said that I don't think we always get. Um, the chapter actually even begins with something called a triad. A triad was a common linguistic element from Hebrew culture, where and they use triads in various different ways. They use triads for drama. They might talk about three different things in anticipation of a fourth that was to follow. And so one of the ways that that language had a habit of building up the drama was to mention three things. And now you're waiting for the shoe to drop, as it were, for that fourth thing, which then changes everything. And this was one of the many ways they used the triad. Another way that they used the triad was in that language, it was a very common habit that if they were trying to talk about something and define it, and it wasn't easy to define, or they had this clever creative way of defining something, they would say something in three different ways. And by looking at all three different ways that they say it, and you realize when I say all three of these different things, I'm actually saying the exact same thing three times in a row. This is their way of showing you that these different ideas expressed in the triad are identical. And so we find that this begins with such a triad. But we don't have that kind of a linguistic element in English. So we just think we're seeing a list of three things being asserted, not realizing that there's a claim here that they are one and the same thing to say. And let me read it to you as it comes from a common translation, and then I'm going to talk about these words and what gets lost in translation. But it begins by saying, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God." Now, this is that triad. And this word is one I want to talk about before I unpack this triad and try to show you what is being claimed here as being totally equivalent. Um, this word is in the Greek originally the word logos, and we've used this word quite a bit in theology to the point where I think we've almost squeezed the life out of it. But I want you to know something. This word did not have any significant theological meaning when the Gospel of John was first written. And so John is not attempting to make a, a, a statement whereby he is relying on a keenly theological concept for clarity. It became a keen theological concept afterwards. And because it became a keen theological concept afterwards, as Christian history went on, the theological concept of this word, logos, gathered even more baggage than it had when John used it. And as a result, when John used it, he had no clue what kind of baggage this word was going to acquire after he had used it. Uh, that he didn't know. And so John is not saying in this passage here what it is we attribute now to the meaning of this word based on the baggage we've added to it since the day he wrote it. But here's my understanding of some of the history behind this word. It comes from a habit of talking about expressions. And Greek had this word, logos, to talk about such expressions, as were often in most contexts where you see this word used, say not in the Bible or not in the biblical text. It's usually talking about an expression, a moment of where somebody said something that meant something. And it wasn't just used to talk about an expression. By the way, it wasn't talking about words. It was really talking about expressions, perhaps entire speeches, perhaps an entire sentence, or at least an entire communication, or even just it could have been a single word if the single word communicated a full and complete idea. But the word itself, logos, really was a reference to the expression itself. But not just any expression. Anytime we speak up, we're really, in some sense, expressing something. But this was a word that was often used whenever an expression communicated something that left you, once you had heard the expression, on your own to draw certain conclusions. It was an expression that led you on to realize other things that, having heard this expression, you will now discover on your own without perhaps further help. And so there's a sense here in which this word was connected with reasoning or logic, or in fact, that's where we get the word logic from. It grew out of this word logos. And but we have this concept of an expression that leads to a conclusion. And so what I see John saying is something here that's very interesting. And in some ways it's is unusually mystical for the Jewish religion and for a lot. And John said a lot of mystical things oftentimes, but then he said them in simple words. He didn't use those $5 words. He used the 50-cent words to say many things. He said, in the beginning was this expression that leads to a conclusion, in the beginning. And he says this expression, this word, was with God. And of course, this is hard to understand. With God. What do you mean with God? Hanging out with God, around him? Of course, the prepositions are used oftentimes in languages in ways that are extremely arbitrary, and they can travel far and wide from their actual root meaning. Here, I think the word is pros, which is kind of has a to or a toward or a facing, alongside of. It has more of that sense of proximity is there, but yet prepositions in most languages can be used in many ways that where its specific uniqueness may be totally ignored, and it may even acquire a particular sense only in certain phrases by the popularity of its usage. So this means that understanding prepositions, particularly in a dead language, can be very difficult. So I don't get the impression that what John is trying to tell us that is that the word was with God, but rather I get the impression that when he uses this concept of with, that he means combined with, that this is part of what it means for us to think of God. Uh, that so in the beginning was this expression that leads to a conclusion, and this expression that leads to a conclusion, it's part of what it means for God to be God. And he says, lastly, the word was God. So in this triad, we're left with trying to discover that John is saying he's personifying the expression that leads to conclusion. And of course, since John, more than any other um, writer, made it very clear that God is spirit, he's not really talking about real words. He's not really talking about real expressions. He may be talking about real conclusions, but in a sense, he's even talking about things that are inarticulate. He's talking about, well, faith, hope, love. These are words difficult to articulate and unpack what they actually mean. They tend to mean things that go far deeper than words do justice to. And this is part of what John is saying here, I think, in this first verse here, as we've broken it out, that we find that he's saying this comment about God and who he is. He was with God in the beginning, and he repeats that as a way of coming back. It sounds to me like we had a comment that came up, and I want to take a look at that. Viewer comment. How do you deal with the lack of a definite article at the end of that verse in reference to theos? I don't. As I understand it, the article as used in Koine Greek was used with no significant, necessarily any significant meaning. There are just some words that were in particular structures associated with the article. Uh, And when we call it, as you mentioned here, let's see, the definite article. Um, the only reason why we call it a definite article is because in our language we have definite and indefinite articles. And it's probably even more appropriate to say article. It's neither definite nor indefinite. It's just an article. And there are some structures of Greek where the article was required and some structures where it wasn't, and this probably had more to do with the proper separation of words or the habit of speech. And there's not that many ways in which Greek would use the article as if, um, like if I had to, I've sometimes shown people my guitar that's behind me that's like George Harrison's. It's not it's the guitar George Harrison played. It's not the guitar that George Harrison played. He didn't play that specific one, but he played one a lot like the guitar that's behind me. It's a Gretsch country gentleman. Now, we have in English this ability to use the as a definite article in a sense. So I am I suppose there would no doubt be places where the use of an article was arbitrarily or optional, and where that option might be significant, no doubt. But I don't know that in this text it has any significance other than structure. It was proper grammar to say it that way, and I don't think that there was any implication at all offered by the presence of the article here. And at least that's the conclusion I've drawn. The others might differ. I don't know who does, if anyone. But anyhow, I don't make anything of it at all. Its presence or its absence would not be to me necessarily significant. Um, anyhow, continuing on. Good question though. Because there's some groups that would want to make a big deal out of that. Um, and then he kind of reiterates it. He says he was with God in the beginning, which is kind of a repeat of combining the first two parts of the earlier triad. Um, so John is saying something about the very nature of God, and he's saying something about the very nature of in the beginning. Now, I don't know what John actually means by beginning. The beginning of what? Um, the beginning of all time, the beginning of significant time, the beginning of historical time, the beginning of the Hebrew nation, the beginning of when they first met Jesus. I mean, it isn't really clear, but it's possible he's actually referring to before anything was ever really moving. And Um, that's my impression. But then again, I don't think that I can compel that from the text. It just seems to be the flow of meaning here, particularly when he's talking about the very nature of God and talking about withness with God and the beginning as of withness, and as it were, and the essence of who it is and what God is. So it just seems to me more sensible that this concept of beginning, which is capable of being used in many different ways, is a reference to the beginning of everything. You know. But anyway, he goes on to clarify, in a sense, that this is something that we're attributing to very God by talking about in Him. It says, "Well, through Him all things were made, and without Him nothing was made that has been made." Now, this isn't just an attribution of creation to God. Oh, by the way, just saying the word creation reminded me of something that I read by one of my favorite theologians, is a guy named Jim Fowler. I like Jim Fowler a lot. I like what he has to say. Um, and he wrote a book actually called Creation and Evolution, and he tried to define um, creation as something very different than creationism. And he tried to define science as something other than scientism. And of course, as a theologian, he fully accepts the concept of creation, and he fully accepts the concept of evolution. And so he, in his book, writes about that. But here, we have a sense here when John is talking about through him all things were made. Without him, nothing was made that has been made. Here, we're even talking about attributing to God, not just attributing to God this creation, but attributing to God the fact that he is an expression that leads to a conclusion, which seems to give a sense of motive to existence, that it serves some sort of a purpose in a sense. Now, just what John is saying about that and what he intends to imply about that, he never really goes into it. And just whether or not I even agree with him or not, I haven't decided. I think it's even possible that if it is entirely true what he's saying, that it's true at a level we can only, in a mystical sense, connect with, which is perhaps why he's saying it, because he doesn't go into detail in the rest of the book to unpack that, to tell us what he meant by it. He says, beyond that, in him was life, and that life was the light of all mankind. In him was life, and it was the light, and that life was the light of all man. In him was, excuse me, I'm getting confused. In him was life, and it was that life that was the same, that was the light of all mankind. I take it this is a poetic way of referring to the fact that human beings are made in the image of God. And I think that John is also trying to draw together this idea that if God is the expression that leads to conclusions, man is as well a little chunk of that expression that leads to conclusions. We have questions. We look for answers. And when we find answers or think we find answers, it can significantly alter the sorts of things we think. And that's true of our nature, and it's true of our Creator. And I think that John is making reference to this. And it's amazing how he just uses small words to say things here that are unsearchably deep. It's to me, it's extremely clever. And I don't think he's trying to be clever. I think he was a deep genius who connected with common sense and just had simple, easy ways of saying things that were just so relevant and true as he understood them. He tells us that this light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. I get the impression that what John is doing here is he's poetically talking about the fact that, you know, history isn't going so well. Mankind is struggling. We are filled with violence, evil, and we live in a world that is so darkened from the reality of God, darkened from the expression that leads to good conclusions, darkened from the fact that it is not only God who is this that we have hard time seeing. We are this too, and we have a hard time seeing it. And yet, John speaks in hope in saying that, quite in spite of how dark it's gotten, this darkness has not overcome the light that is in us. And he says, he refers this as being the light that is in all mankind. So John is not giving us an us and them kind of concept when it comes to how we relate to God and who God is to each of us, and who he's later going to identify this as Christ that he's talking about, and who Christ is to all of us. So there's a very strong sense of total inclusiveness that John is is talking about here, I think, quite clearly. And he says that this light shines in darkness, and the darkness can't overcome it. It's indelible. Who and what you are, what your potential is. I don't care how low you fly. I don't care how low it goes. I don't care how scarred or damaged we are. There's something about us as human beings that remains so awesomely precious and so awesomely godlike that you just can't stamp it out. It can't be done. It remains. And this is, in a sense, that flame which we can fan, which we can invest in and bring out the best. This is one of the reasons why I've defined grace as some people would define grace as God overlooking our horrible wickedness by being kind and nice. But I don't think so. I don't think grace is giving us something somebody else deserved. I understand grace, the concept of grace, as we see it coming from Jesus, as being, wait a minute. Sure, there's all these horrible, awful things that we could talk about. But I want you to know something. There is something there inside of you that is the core of you, that is the foundation of who you actually are as a human being. And this is something that remains completely undefiled. And this is what I have come to invest in, because if I invest in this, all that other crap can just float away. It can just simply be displaced by the growth of this, which is the basic you. And as a result, it becomes not just a non issue because God decides to make it a non issue. It's a non issue because, in the end, if we invest in what's really you, this chip off the old block of being the expression of that which leads to a conclusion, then we have in this everything we need to completely rebuild anything that's been lost. And so, therefore, nothing's lost, really. It's just a temporary setback. And we don't even have to look at the issues or the things necessarily, except to perhaps properly deal with them. But in terms of becoming, just invest in what you already really have, what's already there, that is indelible, that the darkness can never extinguish. And this is the foundation of the concept of God and of man that John wants to begin his gospel with, as understanding that this is where what he has to say is where it comes from and where it's aimed at. He then tells us about this man sent from God whose name was John, and it's a different John. He's talking about John the Baptist, not himself. And he came as a witness to testify concerning the light, so that through him all might believe. And that is, he's really making a reference to the fact that part of what John was going to say was going to be something that would help to clear up the fact that which the darkness could never extinguish remains very viable. Viewer comment: this is making a lot of sense to me, Bob. Thanks. Well, thank you. I appreciate that. Um, by the way, I've avoided talking from the actual biblical text because to me, it is a thing that is so overdone and so hard to hear without hearing so much of the traditional um, garbage that I really like to avoid doing it. So I'm really venturing out in a direction I enjoy going in, but that I also feel is so dangerous to do sometimes. So I'm going to try to tread lightly. But anyhow, moving on, I want to keep my eye on the time as well. Um, he starts talking about how there's a guy named John who comes from God, as it were, and he came as a witness to testify about that light, so that through him all might believe, and that he is the, and this is that we might believe in the true light, which gives light to everyone. And this light is now coming into the world. I get the sense that John is saying, look, we have a history here with the worship of God and all this stuff, but I want you to know something. It's all been in the dark. There is something within us that is now finally getting expression. and there is someone coming to express it and express it clearly. And this is now coming. And so that, he himself was not that light. John wasn't that light. He was coming into, he was, now I want to take a look at these verses here without getting too many of them confused here. I got them written down on a little uh, prompter here. Uh, he came as a witness to testify concerning that light, so that all through him might believe. He himself was not the light. He came only as a witness to the light. Kind of a long, verbose way of trying to clarify the fact that, although, John came to clarify this, he's not talking about himself. Um, the true light that gives light to everyone was coming into the world, the true light. And he came, he was in the world, and though the world was made through him, the world did not recognize him. Well, now this contrasts with the darkness that couldn't overcome, but it did obscure. And it's a sad thing to realize that this is the condition we find ourselves in. We are people in whom that divine spark of the image of God is indelible, cannot be erased, cannot be destroyed, remains very valuable and precious, and what gives us a real core sense of value, and we can never, ever lose that value to ourselves, to each other, or to God. And it's a real value. When God seeks to redeem man, he's not just saying, well, let's forget about all the sin. Let's see if we can make some people happy. Oh, no. Oh, no. Oh, no. This is God saying, there's something here that's so valuable. We can't let this fail. We can't let this perish. We can't let this not arrive at its true and proper development. It's too valuable. And that's the way God feels about human beings, all of us, in spite of all the horrible things that we do in the dark. Um, and we didn't recognize him when he came into the world. We didn't. Wasn't there. He came to his own, but his own did not receive him. Now, here, I think that I don't really think that this is as serious a statement as it might sound. If all mankind has the spark, there's a sense in which Jesus isn't really exclusively the Jews, but the Jews did perceive the Messiah as being someone who was exclusively theirs, and I think Jesus sometimes even said it, but in mockery. Hey, what are you talking to me for? I was just sent to the lost house of Israel. And I think that Jesus was kind of poking fun at this concept. But here, John isn't really reaffirming the concept. He's saying he came to those people who were waiting for him, who thought we're the people he's coming to. And they didn't recognize him. They didn't recognize him. They didn't receive him. They didn't like him. He was going to upset the apple cart. He was going to change their religious system. They weren't too keen on that. Yet to all who did receive him, to those who believed in his name, it says here in verse 12, he gave the right to become children of God. I hate the way that verse is translated. I think it destroys. After John has given us this tremendous preamble to his book, we then go in and we turn it into a radical us and them through the mistranslation. So far, he has an extremely inclusive flux to his language here. There's a flow here of all inclusiveness, and even of recognizing that there's this artificial sense of those who were in particular thinking that Jesus was to come to them. They didn't receive him. So now the verse 12 gets translated in a manner that does appear to begin a harsh, severe, and complete us versus them exclusivism. And so I reject this particular translation. I would rather see it as trying to express something more along these lines. We're struggling. We're in the dark. The reality of this light has been obscured. And it's difficult to see how Jesus is an expression of who God really is. That can be hard to see, but some people will see it. Some people will see it sooner than others. Some people will not see it in this lifetime. They will see it after the grave. And that's fine, as long as we all really see it, and I believe we will. But he's saying that to those that actually begin to see that this is who Jesus is, those who come to that reality in the sense of Peter, that Peter meant when he said, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." People who see this, um, we're not given the right to become children of God. What we are given is the authority to realize that that we are the children of God. It gives us the authority to recognize that this is what we are. And of course, if there's any us and them, there are those of us who have discovered that we all are children of God. And there's some who have not discovered that. But it doesn't change the fact that we all are these children of God. And so I see John as really saying that to those who did see this one that came, who is the light, the one who gave us life, the one who was referred to in the beginning of his book here, that these are the people who begin to realize you have all the authority you need, just being who you are, to realize you are the children of God. Children not born of natural descent, we're not talking about that, nor of human decision, but born of God. You are the children of God, the offspring, the conclusion of the expression of his creation. And then verse 14 goes someplace I think is awesome when it says, and the word, or this expression that leads to conclusions, became flesh, and he made his dwelling among us. Actually, where it says there is he tabernacled among us. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. There is a freedom in discovering the person of Jesus for who he really is. And he's not this horrible, horrible person that is sometimes depicted, in my opinion, by Western traditional Christianity. Jesus came with an extremely different ethos, sense of message, and sense of communication when he came. And I find in the Gospel of John, this extremely mystical connection of recognizing that that spark of reality and humanity that is in each of us is a portion of that very thing which represents the very nature of who God is, and the embodiment of this in Jesus dwelling among us. And he still dwells among us. He's not here in that kind of flesh anymore. He's here in this kind of flesh. He lives in each of us. And I want you to know something. The darkness still obscures it, still makes it difficult to see, but the darkness is not strong enough to completely obliterate it. There's still enough of it there that dealing with other human beings in love, in kindness, in openness, in honesty, and being Christ-like, in recognizing our attitude toward each other, we can invest. We can invest in this in others by recognizing that other people, that we ourselves, are to our deepest core made of that which is extremely indelibly valuable, and treating other people respectively. This is the way that we can invest in this. This is the way this can be made to shine. And this is the glory that can shine forth, and that we find that Jesus was totally full of this coming forth from who he was. And this is who he is in us. Now, I want to just close up. I only have a few minutes. I talk about our union with Christ. I talk about Christ in us. And when I do that, I'm not talking about Jesus being in us, displacing us. In a sense, I'm not even really talking about the person Jesus being located in us. What I'm talking about is that who Jesus is, his essence, his being, that this is what is in us. There is within us that resonating element of essence that resonates with who Jesus is. and we are in union with that. We are in sympathy with that. We vibrate with it. It sets us ablaze because it becomes one with us in a way where it's difficult to tell where we begin and Christ ends in this deepest part of ourselves. But it is an inarticulate, deep part of ourselves, so that we can't really take it from there and start talk as if we have all of these revelations and insights and understandings that we can just be all cocky and dogmatic about. But anyhow, I wanted to talk a little bit about this concept of the word. And thank you for giving me some time to do that with you. And I hope that you got something out of it. And send in some more of your questions and comments. And thank you so much. I'm Bob Greaves. They call me the Unconventional Pastor. And I'll see you around. Take care.
Ladies and gentlemen, stick around. In just a moment, myself and Dr. Jones will be on stage with a bunch of you in Google Hangouts. If you're not joining us each week on Google Hangouts, you're missing out on some fun, so be sure and find out some information about that. But in the meantime, this week should be an incredible discussion, and we hope you're with us. Stay tuned.